Hello and welcome again to another edition of Flicking Thoughts with our own author, Bob O'Neill. Appreciate you again joining us for another talk. We mentioned we kind of introduced our discussion, kind of what these next series of videos are going to be of the book Lessons of a Decade. So if you haven't seen our first kind of introductory video, watch that. We'll put a link up there. But the first actual getting into the meat of it, we're going to talk about his first three chapters, which is the weapons used in the Civil War. He starts off by talking about the Saber, then he goes to the Revolver, and then the Carbine. Now, the first thing I noticed after reading those three chapters was the Saber section. The chapter of the Saber was 10 to 15 pages, right? And then the Revolver, maybe 5-ish pages, and the Carbine, which is, I guess, from a trooper's point of view, the primary weapon that they use most of the time, he relegated to basically a page and really only talked about it in the use of dismounted fighting. So what was your initial take in kind of your thoughts on his view of, let's start it with the Saber.
So I think it's one of the areas where you have to look at it and say that he's trying to stay with the older image of the cavalry.
Yeah, definitely.
And not recognizing that the cavalry has transitioned, that cavalry combat has transitioned to more mounted infantry fighting. That
right.
He liked the idea of light cavalry fighting, I think. The European tactics
right.
that he refers to a lot, the mass saber charges of, the paintings that he might have grown up with as a young man. I don't say that to denigrate him, but that's the romance of the cavalry that we talked about in the first episode.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that was where the cavalry was going to go. And again, we had the benefit of hindsight. We know,
right.
That it didn't.
Now, one thing he mentions in that chapter of the Saber is that he says that there has been no evidence that if a Saber charge, and of course he qualifies it by if resolutely pushed, would fail to drive off a line of pistols or anything like that. In your experience or in your history or your research, have you ever come across a situation, whether it's Brandy Station or Winchester or wherever, these famous cavalry engagements occur? Of course, Trevelyan Station in 64, but we won't go to 64. Is there anything that you can pull off the top of your head that would even either qualify this or discount this as far as Saber charges or pistols? Or, I mean, from what you know on your research, what have you seen as far as actual firsthand accounts?
So, yeah, there's primary evidence in actual battlefield incidents where it completely disputes that assertion he makes. Now, I don't know his record very well.
Right,
when he enters the 6th New York Cavalry, exactly when he gets to the theater of conflict. The 6th New York was, I believe, comes in, and part of the regiment is on the peninsula in the summer of 62. But in the summer of 62, at the Battle of Gaines's Mill, the 5th U.S. Cavalry makes a saber charge at Gaines's Mill to try to save Union artillery. That alone is an idea of how obsolete the thinking was on what cavalry could do and couldn't do.
Right.
So they're put in a bad position, but the Confederate infantry aren't awed by them at all. Mm-hmm. They break up and
right.
decimate the cavalry charge very quickly, and then just continue with what they were going to do. It's almost like they swat them aside, like you would swat aside a bug or something. Mm-hmm. There are other incidents. So the Battle of Cedar Mountain in August of 1862, August 9th, I believe.
Yeah.
The 1st Pennsylvania Cavalry makes a charge against infantry,
right,
and is shot up. And there are a couple of other incidents. So he may not have been there. He may not have known, firsthand. But some of those, the knowledge of that should have carried over. That he makes some of these assertions as all encompassing.
Right,
this did happen or this didn't happen.
Right.
And he gets a little beyond, the reality there.
Yeah, definitely. Now, one thing that I do like that he does with each of the chapters is he kind of focuses on one thing. For the Sabers, his primary focus really had nothing to do with tactics, had to do with the bluntness of their sabers. Now, again, that's kind of beyond, in a way, kind of beyond the conversation that we're having, because we're more focused on the tactics and the actual happenings in the field. But have you come across any references from other officers or anything else that either complain about being dull, or that the sabers are worthless, or that they don't cause as much damage? Because again, Whitaker's whole intent really is, what I think his main point is, if they were sharpened, then coming across a charge of sabers would, I mean, just the slightest scrape would have caused a massive cleave in a guy's shoulder or something like that. And just knowing in modern, like, martial arts or modern knife fighting, pretty much one of the things they say is you're gonna get cut up, and man, you have a sharp knife, and it doesn't take much to kill someone. And so, I guess, have you heard of other officers talking about the dullness or the bluntness or the use of the saber?
I have, and I can read you some statements here in a minute. I'll be interested as a reenactor to your point of view. And I have at home a wrist breaker from the war, an actual period weapon. I've never tried to sharpen it. One of the things I think he says was that the way it was manufactured prevented it from being sharpened to what he called a razor edge. Yeah. In fact, there are any number of instances, at least early on, where they were told and provided with grindstones, and they would be told before a campaign to grind their weapons. Yeah. Now, the idea of how that would work compared to the modern tools we have, where we could put a quick edge on something, would be much more time consuming. I don't know anything about the metallurgy of the swords and the sabers, how easy it was to put an edge on them. But before I read them, I do know that as I work on redoing the book I'm doing now, one of the things that I did was try to come up with a very accurate list of casualties, and then take that and look at those men's pension files. Right. And then figure out how they were wounded and by what weapons, shell fragments, pistol balls, carbine balls, or sabers. And there's not a lot of men that I can tell who are killed by the saber, but there are men who are completely run through the chest with a saber. Really? And survive. I mean, it's a through and through wound, frontwards to back or back to front. There are men who have pieces of their skull cleaved out and survive it. Really? But they will wind up with a depression, an open wound in their head. Right. And they would also be concussed by it. Mm-hmm. So part of it was the strength of the blow. And you read accounts of where men would stand in their stirrups to deliver a heavier blow. Well, if you just took that over your head, it didn't matter if you were killed. If you're knocked unconscious and you're knocked out of the saddle, then you're prone to being trampled or run over. But you're at least out of the fray at the moment. So it had its effects. And I think what gets lost with the saber in reality is that we have all these romantic images of mass lines of infantry marching to battle with a bayonet attached to their rifle. Yeah, definitely. And we know, I think, fairly conclusively that there were not many bayonet wounds inflicted during the war. I don't think that's really an arguable point at this era. So it was kind of a psychological thing. Men didn't want to come to a point where they were going to be brought up to the bayonet. But the saber was essentially the same kind of a thing. It's parallel. A psychological weapon, and where the infantry would, and I'm not denigrating the infantry, would shy away from getting to bayonet combat. Yeah. Early on especially, that's the only way the cavalry could fight. They had to go hand to hand. Right. And it took a different kind of a man, I think, to go in knowing that this is what you're going to be encountering.
Right.
So there's something to what he's saying, and then it's just a matter of how it evolves.
Yeah, and he does address that because when he says, they need to be sharpened and have a razor's edge, but then his reasoning for that is once there is a single fight, I forget the exact words he used, but he says basically once there's one or just two fights, then the moral effect, the morale of the ones who have been kind of beat up, that would be the true effect. That's one thing I do like about Whitaker throughout his entire book is he really focuses on the effect of morale, the effect that people who have confidence can do, and people who have been beat, their low morale, what that effect is. And so I do like, especially from a modern perspective, understanding morale. Not to say it's everything, but it's definitely a huge part in the success or failure of a unit for sure.
I think you're exactly right. And so in 1863, you do have some massed cavalry combat at Brandy Station. Mm-hmm. Sabers used quite a bit. When you get up to Aldie, Middleburg, and Upperville, the terrain changes, and they're still trying to use the saber. And so it becomes easy to denigrate someone like Judson Kilpatrick for ordering saber charges in different terrain.
Yeah.
But to your point, I think we had to look at why that was happening.
Yeah.
He wanted, I think, and everyone looks at Kilpatrick as a fool, and that's a cliche that kind of carries over, right. I think. There was something to that, what you just said, that confidence. If you could drive home a charge to a hand-to-hand conflict and survive that and come out of that and know that you had bested your opponent in that kind of fighting, that is going to instill a certain amount of confidence in you.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think that was one of the things that he wanted them to do, to know that you now have the wherewithal, you have the drive, you have the experience, whatever it took to drive home a charge and best your opponent at close range. That not everything was going to be done at 100 yards or 50 yards or 25 yards. There was a time and a place to drive it home, and the men had to know they could do that and survive.
And I think it kind of, again, how they talk in modern military, success drives success. And of course, failure can have the effect of driving further failure for sure. So that's good. Go ahead. Actually, let's go ahead and see what you got.
A couple things. Some of these come from letter and order books, some of them from telegrams. But these are all actual comments. So in an undated telegram from 1862, then Colonel William Averill is telling Colonel David Gregg at the time to obtain a dozen grindstones and sharpen the sabers 18 inches from the point.
Oh.
So not only is he telling them to sharpen the sabers, he's giving you a distance on how
so 18
far
inches
up the
down
curve,
from the point. Okay.
It was supposed to be done. A diary entry or a letter from the 1st Michigan, January of 1862. Soldiers telling his family home, I thought it was time to be sharpening the saber. I made the point so sharp that I'm only afraid that I won't get a chance to stick it through some secession's jacket. June 15, 1863, that this is the day of or 2 days before the fight at Aldie. So it's post Brandy Station, but before Aldie. Butterfield, who was Hooker's chief of staff, so this is coming from the head of the Army. The general directs that you have your command ready to march to daylight on the 17th. That's the day of the fight at Aldie. Sabers ground, horses shot, and all in order. June 20th, 63, so it's carrying on now to the middle of the war. A letter from a 7th Michigan trooper. They were looking forward to this is June 20, the big fight at Upperville is June 21st. They were hoping to be involved in that. They were not going to be. But he's writing, we have 3 days' rations in our haversacks. Our blacksmiths are busy shoeing all horses that need it. Our revolvers have all been emptied of the old loads, thoroughly cleaned and reloaded, ammunition issued, and our sabers ground. And one more, June 21st, again, same period. A different member of the Michigan Brigade. It's not the Michigan Brigade at the time, but William Sorley. This is the 5th Michigan. His saber is sharpened. It cuts like a razor. He turned the grindstone yesterday while I sharpened mine and his. So that's just a couple actual incidents of actually sharpening the weapon.
That's interesting. You actually, because at least just 2 or 3 of those references talk about grinding their sabers sharp as a razor or really sharp, and then moving on. And Whitaker, maybe he's just ignorant. But Whitaker says he spent an hour at a steam powered grindstone, and with his aim saber couldn't get it
an edge on
couldn't get an edge on it. And so one of the comments we had from our previous video on that subject was that he had to be incompetent using a grindstone or sharpening a saber, because it doesn't take much. I mean, it doesn't take an hour to do that. And that's interesting that just a normal trooper mentioned that he was able to, it didn't say how long, but he was able to put a razor's edge on it relatively, well, I didn't say easy, but he was able to do it.
Yeah, so we don't really know. We know modern weapons. We don't know
Right.
how, I have no idea how a grindstone would work, but they were available.
They were there, yeah.
The brass, if you want to use that term, was making sure they were available, issuing orders to grind them. But my sense also is, and we'll talk about it with carbines and other things in a few minutes, is that the soldiers weren't going to do this on their own.
Yes.
Yeah, there's that human nature factor of we're going to do only as much work as we have to do.
Right.
You would think we would rely on our life is dependent on the quality of our weaponry, and we would pay more attention to them. But as we'll see in a little bit, they weren't going to do this on their own, so somebody had to make them do it.
And actually, again, Whitaker says that in the Saber section, the Saber chapter, where he says that really the troops had the same feeling of the Saber as their officers did, because if the officer was someone who was proficient in fencing and Saber maneuvers and tactics, then he would instill that same, if you will, esprit de corps into his men, and they would practice and they would fence and they would work, and they would be confident in that weapon, whereas the vast majority of officers didn't feel comfortable themselves, and of course didn't, and that transferred over to troopers to where they weren't confident either. And you're not going to use a weapon in life-threatening situations that you're not confident in using.
Right.
Which is why I think the pistol was so popular for sure.
Yeah, if you're not drilling in it, that's how you're going to instill your confidence, and then you got to take that onto the battlefield where, it's one thing to drill against a friend who's not actually going to
run you through,
run you through, and when you're out against an enemy and you're in that melee in the field somewhere and you're being hacked at from all around, that's where that confidence has to come in, that you have the strength and the ability to defend yourself, to keep your head on the swivel. I think that probably needed to be on. You know that better than I do, and all that would play into it.
Yeah, no, and I mean, in a melee, like, again, just thinking in my head what maybe Brandy Station would have looked like, or Trevelyan, or, well, maybe not Trevelyan, but I guess Brandy Station is the classic one that comes to my head of what that would have been, because once you engage, or say even East Cavalry Field in Gettysburg, once you engage and you get that big just crash of troops, then they're all around you, and having a 360 degree view versus just what's in front of you that's difficult. Very, very difficult for sure.
And it's something that infantry didn't have to deal with.
Yeah,
I think it gets lost in, again, the idea of why the cavalry took longer. Cavalry officers, in my view, had to have that ability. Everything moved faster. They had to be able to make decisions quicker. The troops had to learn to make decisions quicker. In infantry, linear tactics, everything's a little bit slower.
Right.
I'm sure some people will argue with me about that. But,
Yeah.
I just think that was one of those things that separated them. They had to learn.
Definitely.
And they'd figure out who had the ability to do that and who didn't.
So we're going to move on to pistols, because what I do like about Whitaker is he likes the romance of the Saber. But then he does admit the usefulness of the revolver, and especially the use of the revolver on the Western versus Eastern theater, and of course Confederates versus the Federals. There was a lot of difference between East-West and then North-South. And so basically what Whitaker says, I'm going to open up with this statement. He says that the true use of the revolver lies in irregular warfare, where single combats and sudden encounters of small parties take place on horseback and in narrow lanes among woods and fences where the saber cannot be used. In such places, and wherever regular order is broken up, the revolver is invaluable. In pursuits, patrols, and surprises, is superior to the Saber. And of course, he's got to throw it in there. He ends with, but in line charges, in the field, the latter, meaning the Saber, is always conqueror if it's sharp, right? So he talks about all the Saber stuff, and then he goes into Revolvers and says the Revolver is really good, but the Saber's better, So holding on to some of that romance there. So what is your initial take on either Whitaker's view or your research on the use or the effectiveness of revolvers?
I think in that regard, he's exactly right. And the work I did on the Chasing Jeb Stuart and John Mosby book is the proof of that.
Yeah.
Is that Mosby's men relied upon the revolver. Most of that combat was on narrow roads. They were hitting Union picket lines. Mm-hmm. So they were trying to find a weak spot in the picket line along a road, a 2 or 3 or 4 man outpost, and they would, as they drove in, they'd hit a bigger outpost. But the Union cavalry was pretty much told on picket duty to carry their carbine unslung at the advance, and they would be out like that would be their position on picket. Well, and you set me straight if I'm wrong. I don't care, they didn't have the Spencer carbine at the time.
No,
so even a breech loading weapon, you have an enemy coming at you at a gallop, firing a 6-shot revolver.
Yeah.
You're going to get off one round, and you're going to receive then. I think, if I understand cavalry tactics right, the idea was to drive home an attack. You got an advantage from your momentum. So
yes.
The pickets would be receiving an attack with no momentum at helping them, trying to get off one shot, and then they're at the mercy of the enemy.
Oh, yeah.
They no longer have the time to try to get even a breech-loaded second round loaded, another percussion cap on, or to drop it and transition to a Saber or a revolver. They then are on their own, and so they were always at the disadvantage, and they didn't seem to learn from that. The orders continued to keep them at the same, go out there with your carbine.
Yeah.
And, so I think his example is absolutely spot on. That's where the revolver really excelled. Part of the problem for the Federals early on, too, was that they didn't have the weaponry to give all of the men all of 3 weapons.
Yeah, that's very true.
So on the peninsula, let's say, the regular brigade is ordered to give all their carbines up. Whatever carbines they had, they gave to other regiments, and they were going to be saber and pistol regiments. So they didn't have the ability to do anything at a distance.
Yeah.
And as you well know, then as it starts to transition, they move in, we'll have 10 carbines per each company or something like that.
They did, yeah.
And then, but it took a while as the cavalry, as more regiments come online, it put more demand on the factories to bring these weapons along in enough numbers to outfit. So it was going to take a while.
Yeah.
Whereas the South, every time they captured a man, they were picking up those weapons.
So that's a question I have for you then is, that's 100% right, and actually something we didn't talk about that now you bring it up, I would like to kind of explore a little bit more is, in the ordnance returns, looking at those, it's very clear that, exactly what you said, the cavalry units were not, the military, whether it's the states themselves outfitting their units or the feds, they didn't have the equipment to have all 3 weapons, and so most cavalry regiments, or say mounted infantry or dragoons, whatever you want to call them, they either had sabers and pistols or carbines or rifles, and rarely early on in the war, from what I can tell, did they have all 3. Now, later on in the war is a different story, but do you think, did that have any impact in the disparity between Confederate cavalry versus the Federal cavalry and why they rode circles around them, literally?
I think one of the things that gets kind of scoffed at early on is the notion of the Southern cavalry bringing daddy's shotgun with them, the old fowling piece or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, there is evidence that is a fact. You can look in Confederate officer compiled service records and you can find them online, and find the requisitions where they signed for, say, 10,000 shotgun rounds or 20,000 shotgun rounds. And those carry on through let's say the mid to late part of 1862, and then they disappear. So clearly, those shotguns are not surviving the rigors of, being in the field.
Right.
One, but while you have them, you have an immediate advantage of if you're a saber-armed Union cavalryman closing with a line of men with shotguns. I don't care if they're firing birdshot.
Right.
They have a distinct advantage, and you're not going to do that very long before you go, I'm not going to continue to do that. So that gives them an advantage early on, and then you start to see, some of the transition where it's going to change. But the South had the same problems. They weren't able to manufacture their weapons the same way. They had to rely on what they could get through the blockade or make on their own. So they're all working. Even in 1863, Stuart is husbanding, if that's the right word, or collecting his carbines within one or two companies in a regiment. And he will use those companies for certain things on the battlefield as
tasks
to hold a piece of ground, let the mounted combat move around them. They can then fall back behind them. They have the carbine men in front of them while they reform. So they found ways to work around the limitations. But even later in the war, I think the image is that the Spencer comes in way too early. It's a misnomer that we can never get rid of. That It was there at Gettysburg, and it wasn't, and But in 1864, the Michigan Brigade, George Custer, the 1st Michigan was always, I think, thought, even before Custer had anything to do with it, to be a Saber regiment. And it had a carbine early on that most people never heard of. It didn't seem to hang around very long, was not one of the predominant weapons that we're familiar with. Well, then later on, even as they started to get the Spencer and different things, these men saw, specifically Custer, that there was a time and a place for both. So he kept the 1st Michigan and I believe the 7th Michigan as essentially Saber regiments, where the 5th and the 6th Michigan, which had come up with the Spencer rifle early on, developed their own set of tactics to use that before they were all together as a brigade. He found ways to employ both. So at Yellow Tavern, you will see him call for, the 5th and the 6th to go up and hold ground, and then the 7th and the 1st to go in and take ground. So there was still, even into the latter stages of the war, they were finding a way to employ all three. Weapons.
One thing, going back to the revolvers, two things I find interesting. Like I said before in the previous Saber conversation, that he always seems to have a main focus with each weapon. Sabers, they weren't sharp. They should have been sharp. Revolvers, he just goes off on how the Colt revolver was the most accurate pistol of all pistols out there. And I love at the very bottom, he actually has a little asterisk, a little star that says, oh, by the way, the latest Remington is also really good too. I love that it's a little note at the very bottom here. But have you run across anything regarding the accuracy of pistols? Because here he talks about just right out of the box, the Colt Army or the Colt Navy, just the Colt revolver is it's the most accurate, bar none, and he would rather have an accurate weapon versus a weapon that even loads easier, that's more durable, or that is more reliable in the field. He says, throw all that away. I would rather have something that when I shoot, I know I'm going to hit my mark. What's your take on his focus of that being really his major point of the pistol chapter?
So in my opinion, I've done some shooting. I'm, again, not a reenactor. My sense is that the Remington had a reputation as a more durable weapon, a heavier frame in that regard than the Colt. What I've always heard, although I don't have any primary source from the war to substantiate it, is that the Colt out of the box had a high front sight. A lot of friends of mine who do a lot of shooting today still talk about, they have to file the sight down and make some adjustments to the sight. So to his statement that it was accurate out of the box, I'm not sure what to make of that.
Well, so I've heard the same thing is
Colts, you have to kind of, file that front and side down. But again, kind of going back to where I actually got interested in research and history is going back to primary records, right? And when you say that, there's all these rumors of things you hear. I mean, kind of like you mentioned the Spencer changing the tide at Gettysburg, where when you get into it, I mean, definitely not the case. So with this, the rumor of Colt sites need to be filed down, looking into it, I haven't come across a single primary record, or we're not even say primary, let's say written like this, say 10 years after the war, that has mentioned that. Have you run across anything like that? Or
I don't think I have. And I wonder where, there's a point where that may come in later on after the war.
Yeah.
I don't know that a cavalryman on a horse in a mounted charge is really going to know where his bullets are landing. So he's not going to have the sense of the accuracy of a weapon as opposed to somebody standing and shooting at a stationary target where they can figure out that it's not hitting where they want it to hit. So when you get into things that come up post-war, that's maybe where that comes in, but I'm sure someone can set us straight on that.
Right,
otherwise.
exactly. And going with that, one of the things he ends with is he says that, number one, the troopers that were veteran troopers understood the moral or the morale effect of kind of a fired volley all at once. And he says the veterans would have patience under fire and wait until everyone's loaded to then fire a volley. But what he said is, he said their reserve volley sweeps everything before it. 30 or 40 feet from the enemy's line is the time to fire. And he says all together, aiming low. So number one, that right there tells us kind of how long they waited until they let loose. And of course, aiming low. Of course, they told everyone to aim low at that point in time. But I found that kind of maybe an accent to what you just said. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's limitations on the range of a pistol. Hollywood aside, what Hollywood kind of tells us people could do wasn't the case. Those were, they were revolutionary for the time. It was a great advance over what had come before it. But it was still, not a weapon that was going to shoot a great distance. So you were going to throw your rounds away if you started shooting at too great a distance. As I heard you read that one statement there, I was thinking there's an incident in the fight at Upperville on June 21st where the 8th Illinois Cavalry and probably more men from other regiments are making a mass charge of some size, several hundred men against a Confederate artillery battery. And one of the men wrote a letter a couple of days after it talking about all of our pistols barking at the same time and all these rounds going down. Well, there's only one man in that artillery battery that was a casualty. So it would have maybe, the idea would have, would maybe drive them from the guns for a period of time. But again, you're on a horse.
Right.
I've never tried to hit anything with a revolver on a horse.
Well, he actually says that in the Saber chapter of why sabers are generally better in large engagements is because he says you have a mounted man shooting a pistol at a mounted man who is running, and you're closing distance so quick that it's so difficult and so many variables in that equation that's why he suggested the Saber is better in that engagement. But you're right. It's hard to hit someone.
And there's an incident, and just again, real brief, one thing. The very opening action at Brandy Station, June 9th, the very opening action, Colonel Grimes Davis is leading the opening Union assault across Beverly's Ford. He's out in front of his men. He has a saber. The first Confederate he encounters has a revolver. Ducks under Davis's saber.
Really?
Puts a bullet through Davis's head, and the Union troops lose their leader in the opening seconds of the fight there. So,
so there's your.
I mean, that's kind of a
weapon engagement right there.
It's just a quick example that, as I hear you read that, comes into my head. Everything was relative. There was a time and a place for everything, and if that's what stuck in his head, of course.
Well, it's a 10 years.
He was there, and
So, and kind of closing on the revolver side of things before we move to carbines, one thing that I found interesting in reading this is he actually said, as far as loading in the ammunition, he says, for loading a Colt revolver, a powder flask and loose bullets are much better than the compressed cartridges that they were issued, which to me, like, that blows my mind. Because number one, I mean, from just the supply logistics standpoint, they were issued cartridges in the boxes, and then you load them in your cylinder and you're good to go. And it's considered kind of in the living history side of things, it's considered an anachronism or a kind of an inauthenticity for people who bring flasks in the field and have this loose flask, kind of old school, throw it in the cylinders and then ramming a round down. But I find that interesting that he says that, because his reasoning is that the bullets that the cartridges they were issued were not strong, and they didn't have the power he wanted to fight with. And so I find that interesting. What are your thoughts on bringing flasks in, or either that or the weak charge of the issued rounds? Or
it would just be thoughts more than facts.
You're right.
I agree with you entirely. One, I think the flask was an anachronism. On the other hand, and I'm thinking off the top of my head here as we discuss this, the cartridges they were issued were prepared at a factory, so to speak.
Right.
So other people were preparing them, and you could have, what the control was, the quality control was. Were they getting everything the same all the time, or were things showing up? People got distracted. They had a lot of young women, young men, kids. We hear about worked in those ammunition factories. Was there something to that we've just never heard of, in particular in the primary sources we were talking about earlier, about how that would go off? I've not heard anything. The dynamics, of course, of those weapons would change as cartridges came out, more velocity, more power, what have you, what they could achieve. You would know better than I do, though, the durability, and maybe I think it's something you want to get into here in a minute, is the durability of the ammunition that they had, and how, for cavalrymen, how durable it was to be carried on their person.
And that's actually a good point you bring up. I know when we do events, whether it's a one-day event or especially if it's say a week-long event or a 3-day event or something like that, we carry our pistol cartridges pre-rolled in paper cartridges in boxes in our cartridge belt. And if you just do it for one day, it's all right. But one thing I've noticed is if you do 3 or 4 days of trotting and galloping and riding and mounting and dismounting, when you open up your cartridge box, there's a loose powder everywhere. The paper had ripped, and even it kept in the boxes. They rattle around enough that they tend to fail open or get loose. Mm-hmm. Now, if they're just completely loose cartridges, they won't last a day at all, and that's been my personal experience. They won't last a day if they're just loose in your cartridge box. So, I can see that aspect, because then you don't have to worry about it, you pulling out just an empty piece of paper and trying to, gather the powder around. So I can see how the flask would be, useful. And maybe this is something he did from an officer standpoint, but I just don't see the mass or the large, rank and file carrying flasks and loose rounds.
It certainly wasn't going to be practical.
Yeah.
In combat, you were going to be much more. You weren't going to run back, reform, and have time, I think, for everyone to pull their flasks out and start going through that whole process. I have done that a bit. We have the sense of the time involved in that, so I don't think that's realistic. It may have been a personal thing of his.
Right.
He may have had reason to think that he could control better the amount of powder that went into each round, but. The seating the ball and the whole thing was, I think it was going to be kind of impractical.
Definitely.
But I have read enough instances where ammunition was damaged. The paper cartridges just became, they just didn't hold up.
They definitely don't, for sure. Another thing I find is interesting too, I said I'd move on, but one thing I just circled here is he actually kind of foreshadowed World War One and later on maybe Spanish-American War style aspects to the pistol. So he actually says, one of his recommendations, he says, the revolver on the right hip should have a cord fastened to it about a yard long. That way the men can practice fire and when passing the target at speed, if it's dropped, then they don't lose it, basically. And you find that in later wars and being issued to the American cavalry later on in the war. And of course, I'm not an expert. I'm not even well knowledgeable in World War One, but I think they actually had something like that in World War One. He kind of, I guess, in a way, foreshadowed that usefulness of having a lanyard tied to the pistol. So I mean, based on the amount of pistols we find on battlefields, and maybe that was a common thing of getting it knocked out of your hand. I mean, any thoughts on that?
Yeah,
at all,
I think I agree with you 100%. I think it's one of the things that's the practicality he brings to it in this regard. He knows. The cavalry had a carbine on a sling, so they could, if they could keep it on their sling in mounted combat. I don't know how. To me, it seems rather impractical to use in a mounted charge of carbine. It was certainly used in mounted skirmish lines.
Yeah.
And it was a different kind of, you could drop it and you weren't going to lose it. The Saber had something to, the sword knot or whatever, however they referred to it,
sword knot,
that you could hold it a little bit on your wrist and
drop it. Yeah.
The revolver didn't have that, and they did learn to put a lanyard on. I think even early into the 20th century, you see old police officers, motorcycle policemen.
Yeah.
Who would have their revolver on a lanyard.
Yeah.
So there was a purpose to that. You had to transition quickly. If you'd emptied it, you didn't want to be trying to find your way in while you're, again, better than I to try to figure out what you're doing
to get it in there,
with the enemy coming at you while you try to transition to what you have left to you, your Saber probably.
Even applying that to the modern, early 2000s, doing 3-gun competitions, in college and stuff like that. At the time I was in college in the early 2000s, lanyards on leg holsters for like 1911 pistols or for Glocks or whatever, lanyards were the thing, and for the same reason. Now they've faded away because there's a lot of problems with them, but obviously there's a usefulness to not just dropping and losing your pistol.
Right.
So awesome. Let's moving on to carbines. So the last chapter on the weapons side of things, and we'll end this episode with the last thing of carbines. Again, I kind of open it up, but you have Saber chapter, which is lengthy, the Revolver chapter, which is kind of middle length, and then the carbine chapter he has is not even a full page. In fact, it's right at 1 page. And really, his biggest thing is talking about the usefulness with dismounted skirmishing. And of course, when we talk about the chapter on dismounted fighting, we'll talk about that then. But I find that interesting that Whitaker, he has a whole decade to kind of think about it and write it. But yet, what I consider the primary weapon of the cavalry, especially toward the later part of the war, has barely a page written on it. So why do you think, or what do you think his thought process was here?
We can only take a guess at it.
Right.
Are we right in thinking that he really has this notion of getting back to the way the cavalry was? Because the carbine is going to take the horse out of the cavalry to some extent. And we'll talk about that, as you said, with dismounted skirmishing. It's going to remove what separated the cavalry from the infantry, the horse, from the equation to some extent. And so if there's that romantic part of it in his head, maybe he's got an issue with that. And maybe he just thought, what, everyone knows about the carbine now.
Maybe, yeah.
And,
right.
Maybe he saw that he didn't need to spend time on it because that was, 1870s, we now had the Winchester, the early Winchesters. If this comes out in 1870, I believe, 71. So the more famous Winchesters hadn't come out, but there's, the Yellow Boy and some others are there. We know.
Yeah.
So maybe he figures we don't need to talk about them a lot. And he wants to go back to the way things were. It's hard to get into his head.
Well, I will say what he mentions, the types of carbines he mentions is kind of interesting. So he opens up by saying, he compares the Spencer to the Sharps. Now, at the end of the war in 65, the Sharps was still king of carbines, but the Spencer caught up to just a few thousand. Basically the Sharps and the Spencer were right there neck and neck toward the end of the war. And he actually says The Spencer carbine was laterally in general use toward the end of the war, superseding the Sharps, which actually is inaccurate from the ordnance returns, but close enough. There was little to choose between them, but he says this: I have fired as many rounds in the course of 20 minutes out of a Sharps as out of the Spencer, because the Spencer fires 7 shots pretty rapidly, but it takes time to load, versus the Sharps, which is consistently relatively quick.
I've seen primary sources that back that up.
Really? Okay.
I've seen a number of things that back that up completely, that the time gained at one end is lost at the other end.
Interesting.
There's also a little bit of a weight issue, I think, between the Sharps and the Spencer. So some men would prefer the Sharps, especially if they'd carried it for a period of time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You know, so the Spencer was heavier, I believe. So there was, you know, you're right. I think the Sharps, the Spencer becomes more famous because it's the repeater.
Right.
I think the Sharps did kind of hold in popularity.
Yeah. Well, there's a reason it was the #1 carbine throughout the entire war. I mean, from 61 to 65. I find that interesting. So I don't know. Yeah. I don't know. Sorry, I kind of interrupted you there.
Well, but there's something we'll probably talk about later on about ammunition use too in the Spencer.
Yeah.
And there's some times when that
became an issue.
You could just throw it away too quick, and then you're in trouble.
One thing, so he goes after that, and the next sentence he says, the Henry rifle, or the 16 shooter as he calls it, is a magnificent weapon, quickly loaded and firing as quick as a Colt revolver, and it is also very accurate. Then he compares that repeater to Colt's rifle, which is interesting because both the Henry and Colt's rifle are rifles, not necessarily carbines, and which kind of, I think, reflects the dismounted use of this stuff. And he actually says that Colt's rifle, although very expensive, he's intended to think is what he says, a good or better than any in the hands of men who are trained. He actually says it's actually worthless in the hands of green troops because it takes, training, and the maintenance is kind of heavy and you got to know how to use it. But he actually goes on to say the Colt revolving rifle is his favorite. Interesting.
And it kind of struck me as interesting because it's not a weapon that I understand have ever been in great use.
Especially the cavalry.
The only cavalry regiment I'm aware of is the 2nd North Carolina Cavalry that carried it for a period of time. And I don't know what kind of numbers, whether it was throughout the regiment or not, but they are kind of linked to that. My impression is it had a reputation for, if I use the term properly, chain firing sometimes. That you could, if you didn't maintain it, you could set off the whole cylinder. The Henry never really catches on. I have a Henry reproduction that I love.
I love that thing, yeah.
It has its own awkward...
It does.
The reloading time on there is going to be a little awkward, and the way that it works, and I often wonder how that worked in the field, dropping
rounds
on top of each other like that, if that ever created issues or not. But the Henry I have, other than the weight to it, which is a pretty heavy weapon to stand and fire a long period of time, I love it.
No, I'm the same way. That's my favorite. I wish I could use it more living history events, but there's no use for it.
But the Henry was in production earlier, I think, than the Spencer. Now, I may be wrong, but I know the 1st Vermont Cavalry early on in the war had been offered the Henry. The developer of it had offered it to them early on, and the Ordnance Department then had turned it down, and then it just never seems to catch on once the Ordnance Department finally agrees to the Spencer.
Yeah. The last thing that I think is interesting that he mentions is he kind of randomly throws in the mention of a Howard's rifle. Now I had to look that up because I hadn't seen that. I was pretty ignorant.
You're better than I am. I didn't look it up.
Yeah, right. Well, so I looked it up, and he says, for weight and simplicity, the Howard's rifle excels in simplicity and lightness as any carbine heretofore used in the war. Now I looked it up. It literally looks like a tube with a stock and an open trigger. Like it is the most simple thing out. You should take a look at it. Google it next time you get a chance. I've never seen anything like it before. So I threw that in there because he threw it in there, and kind of interesting. So, but he closes the carbine, the short carbine section with the idea that the weapons he likes the most, both with the Colt pistol and the carbines he likes, require a veteran to know how to use it. He says, both on the pistol and the carbines he likes, that greenhorns or new recruits, they would actually just maintain it into dust. It would rust, it would fail, but for veterans who knew how to take care of it, those were the best weapons. Is there a dichotomy there, or what are your thoughts between complex weapons that are great versus simplicity for green troops?
I want to read you some things in a minute here on the way weapons were maintained even by veteran troops.
Interesting.
First off, the other thing that really comes to mind is when the Spencer was first issued, and this is the Spencer rifle, was first issued to the 5th and 6th Michigan, there was an order given out that they were not, you get your first weapon, you want to dry fire it all the time.
Right, yeah.
And when I got my Henry,
yeah.
because if that's the first lever action you've had, you want to dry fire it all the time, you want to work it. They were, by order, prohibited from doing that because they said that the mechanism was, and I don't know this to be true or not, but was not that durable. It was easily to break, and that they were not to work on their own weapons. If there was any kind of an issue, it was to be taken to an armorer in the regiment to work on it. So there was some issue with that, and I do agree that I think when you look at just the total effect of weather, rain, mud, what they slept in, rode in, just the life they lived on campaign, dust. I mean, tremendous dust and grit getting into weapons. You don't hear them cleaning their weapons very often,
right?
To the extent that I think we do now. I don't even know how often weapons, what kind of cleaning kits they carry.
Right. So that was a question, I guess, bringing my living history experience into it. One thing, out here, there's no humidity, there's nothing, and we don't have an issue with rust. But going back east, the events we do back east, it is, I swear I could just watch my equipment rust, like if I just watched it. You sit down, eat lunch, you stand back up, and your Saber scabbard is rusted, right? And not only my Saber, but my pistol and my carbine, when you wake up in the morning after one night, there's a whole, sheen of rust on my barrel of my carbine.
Yeah, when you wake up and the humidity rises in Virginia at night, 80, 90%, it's like being out in a storm almost with the moisture that's in the air. And so it is a whole different...
I don't know how they kept them not rusted, other than just constantly keeping them oiled or clean or whatever.
So I think, as I said, not to denigrate anybody, but left to our own devices, we're going to do as little as possible. And so even veteran troops would let their weapons rust. And if you just give me a second to find a couple of things here. Okay, so this is an inspection report from August 16, 1862. This is John Pope's chief of cavalry looking at one cavalry brigade in particular. And he makes a couple points which are important. He calls out the company officers in general as being negligent of the condition of arms and ammunition. And he says that for such negligence, there is neither palliation or excuse. As we were talking about earlier, the destruction of ammunition, he said the cartridge box for cavalry ammunition is intended to carry but 20 rounds, and carbine cartridges are so made up that they are broken and wasted by being carried on the person. I therefore recommend that each company carry all excess ammunition above 20 rounds on a led horse. He calls out one regiment in particular in this report, that all of the arms of the regiment were, quote, exceedingly foul, and there is gross inattention to duty, and he highlights this in the part of the company officers. It's something, as I said, I agree with a lot. Now jump ahead to October 30, 1863. This is an inspection report of the Michigan Brigade. So my favorite troops, I hate to see them get called out like this, but this is worth noting. So these are troops now that I think have a reputation as being among some of the very best in the Cavalry Corps. Been around in service now, they're not new troops. Of the condition of the arms, no language can be too strong to express the almost general rusty and dirty appearance of the pistols and carbines. The only arms at all in good order were those that were new. The others were covered with rust of long standing, dirty, and in many cases out of order. A number of their carbines entirely unserviceable from the difficulty of opening the chambers caused by the accumulation of rust and dirt. The Sabers generally were in better order, but by no means in such condition as they should be. He goes on to talk about other things. Now, a couple months after that, a trooper in the 7th Michigan Cavalry will write, "Tomorrow we have a general inspection to see if we can cancel the curse has been brought upon us by letting our arms get so rusty. It is going to be of the whole brigade." And the next day he writes, "Have had a general inspection. We have got our arms clear from rust. Our brass shines. The wax is out of our ears, and we may look for less inspections and a few furloughs." So even late into the war, when you consider all the cavalry combat that had gone on in the summer and fall of 1863 through June, the Pennsylvania campaign, the Bristol campaign, very, very heavily cavalry oriented all that period of time. You would think these troops would by then know to take care of their weapons, and they didn't. I didn't bring it with me, but there's an account. I will have it up on my website soon. I actually was going to use it as the introduction to my new edition of the book and decided not to, but the 16th Pennsylvania comes on early they're rushed into service with the Army after the debacle at Fredericksburg. And the colonel asks that they not be rushed in. He knows that they have no training whatsoever. In February of 63, right before the fight at Hartwood Church, they're on picket duty. And they're on picket duty at about where the Confederate cavalry would cross the river in the surprise at Hartwood Church. And an officer goes out and inspects them, finds them unarmed. It's that romantic notion of, oh, we're going to talk with the enemy. So they're sitting on the bank of the river, conversing with the enemy. Rookie troops against veteran troops. So you get the notion, one, that there's intelligence being gathered.
Right.
But the veteran Confederate troops are seeing that the Union pickets, their weapons are away from them. They're not with the men. When the officer inspects the weapons, brand new weapons, first on, they already don't turn. He can't turn the cylinders of the revolvers. They're rusted shut. So there's a period that this doesn't seem to improve, I don't think, during the war. And I don't know that we can just assume that veteran troops took care of their weapons any more than rookie troops did.
Interesting. So yeah, that's basically Whitaker's thought on the 3 weapons that they were issued. So your overall take between, Whitaker's kind of in closing this episode here, Whitaker's focus on the Saber being not sharp, but if it was sharp, then that would cause a morale that would, on a big Saber charge, be better than pistols. Then move on to pistols, where he thought the Colt revolver was the most accurate thing out there, and that that's way better than anything else. Other than the Remington that has metallic cartridges, as he says there at the end. Then combine that with the carbine, and his favorite carbines are the most complicated to keep. What's your biggest takeaway on what Whitaker thinks overall of the weapons and equipment given to the cavalry?
I think he kind of misses the point maybe in that what made the cavalry so dominant at the end of the war, and again, some may argue with that, but gave them a bigger role on the battlefield was the combination of weapons. That they were useful in more points on the battlefield, the saber, the pistol, and the carbine. And it was how they were able to transition between them. That they could, and he, as we talk about dismounted skirmishing or whatever, he does have a point that, how that would work. And it made them more versatile. And so early on, the infantry looks at them as being basically useless. We're the ones incurring the casualties. We're the ones doing all the fighting. Well, now they could take a bigger role, take a bigger seat at the table because they could contribute more. And I think that's the real key, is that it's not focusing on one over the other. I think for all the things that we talked about, yes, once you showed skill with the saber, and you could go in and drive the enemy from a field with the Saber. It was going to build your morale. The revolver was a different weapon. Again, it was a close combat weapon for all intents and purposes. You were going to have to close with your enemy, not quite maybe to the distance of the Saber, which is really a hand-to-hand weapon, but it was, the old revolvers were pretty much a hand-to-hand weapon if you were going to ensure any accuracy with them. And then the carbine gave you the standoff power to hold ground. So you go from an arm of the army, the cavalry, that could only fight really as an offensive weapon, to an arm of the army that could fight offensively and defensively, holding ground, taking ground, and driving, an enemy. So the three weapons had to be there. They had to be there in numbers, I think, and that really takes quite a while, as you know well from the ordnance reports. That doesn't really happen until late in the war.
Exactly.
You look at records from 1864, there's still not a lot of carbines with these regiments. We have this notion that the Union cavalry was just always blessed with an abundance of weapons. Were they better off than their southern counterparts? Yes. Were they blessed with an abundance of weapons? No, by any stretch.
Definitely not. Well, I appreciate it. We'll go ahead and end that there on the weapons side of things. So join us for our next episode, which will be dismounted skirmishing or dismounted fighting, which is what Whitaker says is what separated the American cavalry from the rest of the world. So we're looking forward to that. Watch us on that. Please like us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'll see you next time.